prepare for your concluding remarks, which will be essentially the conclusions from all of your sessions. We now have Kate Asher, who's the chair of urban development at Columbia University. She also has a professional practice and is a partner at Bureau Happold, which is a well-known engineering firm, and she runs the practice on urban planning. She's also worked in governments in New York and London. So she's worked in government as well as private sector, so she can speak to multiple stakeholders. So, we're excited to have you here with us, Kate. She's going to talk to us about the lessons from, what we can do right in the Portlands with examples from around the world. So, Kate, thank you.
I'm just going to stand here because I don't think I can handle a microphone and a clicker to move and together. So this is actually going to focus mainly on New York. So there are many examples around the world, but I just wanted to focus on some examples that I've been involved in. And we're going to take everybody on a very quick tour through waterfront development in New York City, because we face a lot of the challenges that you're facing with the docklands. We faced them probably about 50 years ago, and we've had many successes, and we've had some areas where we've not been as successful. So I thought, without necessarily addressing any of the lessons that we'll talk about elsewhere or in the session that follows, I thought I'd just give you what we've learned in New York as maybe some directions to think about. So let me start. A little bit of history, and I think the two cities share quite a lot of history, but let me just focus on the maritime history for a second. Manhattan is an island like Mumbai. It's a very linear north-south island as well. It started in lower Manhattan as a trading colony. Much like Mumbai, it was actually a colony of the Dutch West India Company before it was New Amsterdam, and then it became New York. And you can see that it was quite densely packed around the water, with water actually permeating part of downtown. And that river that you see down here is the canal is Broad Street, which is now, of course, the heart of what remains of our financial sector. It became a port as commerce grew. Commerce grew for a number of reasons, but the population really took off in the 19th century. This is really the late 19th century, and you can tell because the Brooklyn Bridge was built. It was built in about 1883. And what I want you to focus on is just the number of ships in the harbor. It was, before anything else, a port and a harbor. And it still is, although you don't see it most of the time when you're in Manhattan, and we'll come to that in a second. So you can see the number of docks that are everywhere alongside Manhattan and along the shores of Brooklyn. And I'll show you some more of those in just a minute. As it evolved in 1928, of course, sailing went away and steam went away, but the number of ships in the harbor, particularly before some of the tunnels and bridges were built and some of the rail freight ones, was enormous. They called it dry shot to New York because you could walk from New Jersey to New York on ships, in theory. It was so busy. And this is, again, lower Manhattan, when you can see these docks, which were absolutely packed, both for cargo and for passengers. And remember, we didn't get into flight in a serious way until really the middle of the 20th century. Looking down on it, just so you can see where we're looking, this is looking down on the island of Manhattan, just to give you a sense of its configuration. I realize that probably every one of you in the room has been there when I hear about all the connections and all the children that are studying in New York, but this is New Jersey, just to reorient you. This is the island of Manhattan, and this is, of course, Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. Okay, so these are 4 boroughs of New York that fit the Staten Island, not shown on the picture. But just to give you a sense, this is the tip of Manhattan, and this is what it looked like. And, being a maritime person, I see a dock at the end of every single street. I mean, this was really the lifeblood of the city. Okay, it was not just Manhattan, though. If you look across the river in Hoboken, this is where the rail service pretty much ended because it couldn't get across the water. And you can see that there are docks here too. This was a very vibrant port community as well. Same thing in Jersey City, and you can actually see a lot of the rail coming in and into here. All of the traffic got lighter across the water to Manhattan, which was the population center. and then again in Brooklyn. And we'll talk about each of these places in turn. And again, you can see that there were docks pretty much everywhere. Okay? Everything changed with this man who most people don't even know. Does anybody in the audience know who this is?
Robert Moses?
No. This is amazing to me. Where is the Admiral? He must know who this is. This is the man. This is Malcolm McLean. He invented the container. This is the man who invented the container and changed our lives, and nobody knows him. He was not a maritime man. A maritime man could never have invented a container because it was a new way of looking at the industry. He was a trucker, and he saw his cotton or his supplies being taken out of his truck with thousands of men put onto a ship, then they're taken out at the other end, and they're moved in a truck, and then they're taken out again. He said, this is crazy. Why don't they just take the back of my truck, put it on a ship, unload it, and bring it to where it's going? It will save countless hours of labor, which of course it did. When he did this, people thought he was crazy, though, because he was not a maritime guy. He'd not been to the merchant marine. People said, you're crazy. And he said, just watch me. He sailed the first ship from New York. So the first container ship in the world left Port Newark, which is right near New York Airport, in 1956. It was a converted oil tanker. It was called the Ideal X, because it was his ideal. And he sailed it to Houston with something like, I don't know, 30 containers, 40 containers, something like that. And you can see they were just dropped on the deck. There was no fancy anything. They were put on the dock and hitched together. And people thought he was crazy and he could never make money because the industry didn't work that way until Vietnam. The war in Vietnam was a turning point because the supply ships were backed up into Nang Harbor and nobody could get cargo to the troops. And they turned to Malcolm and said, I can get this stuff there faster, I can get it out faster, just give me a contract. The American government gave him a contract. He made a ton of money because the ships were empty coming back. He went up to Japan, he picked up cargo, he brought it back. All of a sudden the shipping industry saw him making money and said, I want to do that. And being the kind of guy he was, he said, sure, why not? And he gave over his patent, sort of internationally, because of course it doesn't work if you just do it in one country. You need to do it if it's international trade everywhere. And it became the standard for moving cargo around the world. And of course, his company, which was called Sealand, became a very big shipping company, ultimately acquired by the Maersk company, which is now one of the biggest shipping companies in the world. So you can see this is sort of an evolution of the container ship, which of course today are much, much bigger. So we have this container happening, but we have absolutely no facilities to handle these new boxes. I mean, if you look at what the port looked like, I mean, these were docks on both sides of the harbor. They were finger piers. They were for people to unload your cargo piece by piece, not to handle great machinery and great big boxes. So in the 50s, the Port Authority of New York, which is a bi-state entity, the state of New York and the state of New Jersey own it, said we've got to find a place to properly do this. We had this vision of a new kind of port, unveiled it, and people said, well, what would you put there? And he said, well, we're going to handle container ships. They took an old swamp. This is in New Jersey. So they took an old swamp. There's nobody living there. They surcharged it, they compacted it, and it became essentially the nation's first and probably the world's first container port. Okay? So the difference, and just focus on the difference between this and the finger piers that you saw lying all around the city. And this is, a slightly older view of what Port New York looked like. And it was still considered a bi-state port. Even though it was in New Jersey, it served the region. So it served the region of New York and New Jersey, not unlike JPT, served Mumbai, it was across the water. And to give you a sense of what it looks like today, this is a more recent picture. Of course, it's evolved. It has new container cranes. But you'll see it in this picture. The next one in the back, you see New York City. So it's not right there, but it's not terribly far away. It's absolutely right next to New York Airport. To give you a sense, there's Manhattan, Bayonne, and various other places, and here's the port. Okay? So that's the first history lesson. Okay? So if you learn nothing else today, you now know who invented the container. But what happened in the rest of Manhattan was that the piers were left derelict. There was nothing happening there, and it was sort of the debris of industry, not unlike what's happened in part of the portlands now. You had dilapidated piers, you had old industries, you had elevated highways that really weren't serving anything. There was nothing happening under them. There were parking lots for trucks that were no longer serving the port. So they decided something had to be done. This is essentially what it looked like pretty much all around Manhattan. I Even the sea claimed many of the wooden piers before they could be taken down. You can still see, even today, bits of what was left. So the question is, what do you do with all these old docklands? And they were everywhere. I just circled here to go through very quickly 5 of the places. 4 of them I think are good examples. 1 of them is not such a good example, but there are more. I mean, obviously the docks were everywhere. The first one is Hoboken, New Jersey, which is just across the water. And this is a sense of what it once looked like. It was a very active shipping port with an active trade union. It fell into sort of disuse once the port in Elizabeth and Newark was built. It still had freight moving alongside it, but really nothing was happening on the piers. So what happened was the Port Authority was asked to work with the city. And in theory, that would be a nice combination. The port actually had leased and run the piers, and the city knew what it wanted, and they came up with a plan. And you'll hear a number of cases where the port tried to develop land. This is the Port Authority of New York I'm talking about. They came up with a plan that was going to have development around part of the areas. They were going to have a big marina in the middle, and everybody thought this was a way to really get value out of these disused port lands. Unfortunately, the citizens, when they saw it, went crazy. They weren't really consulted properly, and they decided that is not how they wanted their prime waterfront to be used. So they came up with a different plan, and you can see it keeps the development, it keeps it along the mainland, and it doesn't use the existing piers for residential and commercial development. But the most important thing I think here was that they actually formed a joint corporation to look at how they might do this together, and they brought a number of the citizens groups onto it. This is what it looks like today, and it pretty much followed the trajectory of that new citizens plan with the development on the back. But everybody agreed, going through that as they formed the planning committee and the corporation, was that the waterfront should be open. They had one principle that they all agreed on, was that that waterfront should form the spine of whatever's developed there. And so that essentially helped them to move forward on a plan that became much less controversial, and then the developers came in and were able to get financing, and today this is really what it looks like. So people are very, very happy with it, and the contrast with what it was like when the city and the port first came out, their plan could not be more marked. Okay, so these are just some lessons that I'll point to as we go through them. The nonprofits in Hoboken were super important. They really represented the citizens, and once they had that input, it became much easier to move through the regulatory process. They had this development corporation that was populated by a number of different stakeholders, and they also had one idea that they all agreed upon, and that allowed them to move forward with the individual and phase planning. So many of you have probably seen Hudson River Park. It essentially is along the west side of Manhattan. It's a park that's been created basically out of old piers. Nobody had anything to do with. This is what they look like. The Hudson River was once super active. It was active with cruise. It was active with cargo. It became as dilapidated as anywhere else. That's New Jersey that you're looking at in the distance. This is just debris literally in the waterfront. It also had a highway that ran along it. I'm just old enough to remember the West Side Highway before it was taken down. And it ran right alongside the piers. And the idea was that the piers were served under the highway. That was where all the traffic moved. And the through traffic moved along the perimeter of the city above. It was an old highway. People didn't love it because once the piers were there was nothing happening underneath it. It came to a kind of fateful end one day when literally a car fell through the highway. You can see the car down below, and you can see what happened with the highway. It was great because everybody had wanted to take it down, but there was such inertia. And then a car went through the highway, and it was like, done, it's down. And that was the end of it in one fell swoop. So that was a very dramatic moment. The highway came down, and then everybody said, let's make a great plan. Let's bury the highway. Instead of putting it at grade, we'll put it under the water. And so they had this plan to build out into the water, put the highway underground so that you wouldn't see these ugly cars, and then do real estate development all along the edge with sort of parkland out in the front. Lots of drawings, big plan. It was called Westway, had a lot of support, had a lot of money from the federal government. The only problem was there was a bunch of citizens that didn't like the idea. The reason they actually didn't like the idea, this is in the 1970s when there were oil shortages, is they didn't think that federal money should be spent on roads. They wanted to spend on public transit at the time. They were very upset not so much about the real estate issues, but about the idea of putting so much money into highways at that time. So they basically launched a huge campaign in the courts, a huge public campaign, and I won't go into the details, but they stopped the project. Nobody believed it could be stopped. Everybody was in support of it, but somehow they managed to stop it. So as a result, the city was left with coming up with another plan. It didn't get the federal money, and it decided to make a park out of all of the linear piers that littered the highway, which is called Hudson River Park. They also came up with a plan to put the roadway at grade. And so it had been at grade once the highway was taken down. And now what they decided to do was take the waterfront pieces that existed and create a linear park along here, have a median, and essentially have a smaller road that would move so fast in the middle. So no real estate development along the edge. They set it up as a by-state New York, state of New York and city of New York. Each had equal say and equal responsibility to fund it. They brought in a whole lot of elected officials, representatives from business and the environmental and civic community. So these folks play a role in an advisory council, and the mayor and the governor essentially run it. They set up the trust, they came up with a plan, and they're in the process of implementing it. I would say it's probably 2/3 done. It's a wonderful place to run and walk. Of course, it's small and linear, but each of these piers is now being developed with its own identity. Chelsea Pier is where you can do recreations there. There's sailing, there's marinas, there's kayaking, there's restaurants. There's bunches of things. The one thing there is not is any residential development. It's very, very controversial in New York. If you build outside of the perimeter highways, it cannot be for residential, for whatever reason. And this is what it looks like today. Again, this did not happen overnight. This has been 30 years and it is still not completed. But politically it's completed. A couple of points to note here was that we stayed away from residential development. There is commercial use here. There's a cruise terminal. There's an increasing number of ferry terminals. There's bike rental. There's restaurants. There's Chelsea Piers, which is a sports center. There's lots of commercial uses. All of that money goes to support the park, the actual operations of the park, which is expensive. When you see it, it's beautiful. The plantings are beautiful, but they need to be maintained. There are some structures that are falling down here that need to be maintained, and the way that those will now be maintained is through a transfer of development rights. So the properties that have development rights outboard of the highway will transfer those rights inland to the other side of the highway, and developers will pay for them, and that will support the park going forward and support its completion. So the lesson here for all of us is that there was a long-term plan that was to be financed over 30 years in stages, and literally everything has been working to plan. Each of the phases has come online, and it's gained increasing support as the community has used it. Not dissimilar to Brooklyn Bridge Park, some of you may have seen it. It's the park directly under the Brooklyn Bridge. This was a big area for shipping as well. Huge piers here, so a couple of which are actually still in maritime use. Very close to the Brooklyn Bridge, beautiful views of Manhattan. But again, nothing happening on them for many, many years. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was given the piers to develop. They went out and they hired all kinds of architects. They did a big sort of mixed-use plan for the area. Very, very controversial. The community wasn't consulted. The community didn't want it, and the plan died. They must have spent probably $20 million on the planning, the design, moving everything forward until the community stopped it in the courts. So what happened is they went back and rethought the idea of development on the edge and decided that they would take these piers and reconfigure them as primarily a recreational park for this community, which does not have a lot of park adjacent to it, and it is now sort of in the process of being built. It too has an unusual structure. There was a new development corporation that was set up, not just to run it, but to build it. Because these things are ideas before they're realities. And on that board of directors, they put the city council, appointees by the governor and the mayor, because in New York you get nothing done if you don't have the city and the state together, and a variety of other important people who really need to feel part of anything, partly to get funding, and partly to get through the environmental review process. The big question for this park, the most controversial question, was how are you going to maintain it? You don't have development rights to transfer, how are you going to maintain it? So what they decided to do was to put 1 or 2 residential buildings upland, very, very high end because of the beautiful views, very, very expensive. But even doing that, raised all kinds of antagonism and all kinds of controversy in the community. It took about 2 years to negotiate a deal to allow essentially this one luxury development to be located in the park. It's now being built and being sold, and you can see this is just one of the many meetings that says, no to condos in the park. These condos go for millions of dollars. But I think the public sector and the folks running the park felt it was important to have a maintenance source, so they went ahead and ultimately disagreed that one building can be located adjacent to the park to support its maintenance. And this is what the park looks like today. It's a fabulous park if you ever get a chance to go there. Okay, so again, the lessons are not that dissimilar to other places. It was a new organization. The port tried to develop it. They brought in very clever architects and urban designers. They failed miserably because they could not somehow communicate with the community. But here the real estate industry did play a role in the ultimate funding of the park, but in a very surgical and careful way. I know one of the things that everybody's thinking about for the Portlands is actually some light manufacturing, small manufacturing, that might pay homage to the sort of industrial heritage. I thought Brooklyn Navy Yard might be interesting. This is a Navy Yard in Brooklyn. This is the aerial view. It was once very active in building ships and servicing and repairing ships. Has a long and illustrious history. It really lost its reason for being when shipbuilding and ship repair otherwise became more competitive. They had a lot of huge structures that nobody knew what to do with. So the city decided to basically form a new industrial development corporation with the assets in the Navy Yard and essentially cordon them off from any development. It had a mission to bring these assets back, to use these areas to modernize the infrastructure that was there while maintaining its historical integrity. So the fabric has been changed only marginally, and the idea was to get as many jobs as possible into the existing Navy Yard structure. So this was the plan. Each of the sort of areas of the Navy Yard was identified for a particular type of light industry. They reused the old buildings there. They were cut up into numerous small facilities for different types of tenants who are all doing various forms of light manufacturing. It's amazing to see it today. The maritime facilities, some of them have actually been put back into use. There's a dry dock that's been put back into use, and there's other areas that are being used for ship repair now. And there's also a whole building that's sort of pushed to sustainable manufacturing and different technologies. This development corporation was actually run by the city. The state didn't play a role in it. This continues to be controlled by the city, but people think it's something separate. It's not. All the people who run it are appointed by the city. They integrated all these maritime and light industrial uses in one place, and they protected it as an industrial park so that it could not be sold off. Land in Brooklyn right now is very, very expensive. There's a lot of pressure to develop sites like this. They protected it as an industrial park, and it is not going anywhere. So it employs a lot of people, and it's really taken a very long view, so it's not charging a lot if you're an industrial tenant there. It's really able to hang in there. One bad case study from New York, because we're hardly perfect, is the South Street Seaport, which people think of as some kind of festive retail. That was 20 years ago. It's not. It's a mess. Politically, it's a total mess. If you don't know where it is, it's right at the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge. It was really the prime area for commerce in the 19th century from Manhattan, very close to Wall Street. It's where all the clipper ships came in. It's where all the trading was done. It was a big employer of people. It's where the Fulton Fish Market was. It sort of fell into disrepair as shipping moved elsewhere, and it didn't know what to do with itself until the Rouse Corporation came in and made a sort of festive marketplace like they did in Boston with Faneuil Hall, brought in all these retail uses and tried to keep some of the old structure. There was also a historic preservation district that was created in a somewhat strange configuration there as well to preserve some of the 19th century buildings. And it worked for a while. When people were going to these places, it worked for about 10 years. You can see the old counting houses with the shops below it. But eventually, it sort of got tired, and people didn't want to inject money into it. And then Sandy came, and on top of it, sort of the flood completely destroyed the seaport. The problem with the seaport is there's never been a planning entity, and there's never been a master plan or a strategic plan for it. So it has a very tangled web of ownership. It's got the city's got long-term leases with various corporations. It's now actually the Howard Hughes Corporation, no longer the Rouse Corporation. They own certain sites, the city owns certain sites. You cannot figure out how to plan with all this tangled web of leases. At this moment, the private entity, Howard Hughes, is going ahead and rebuilding some of the historic structures in a way that not everybody likes, but some people do. This is going to be a big retail complex where the old Pier 17 was. But the piece that everybody in New York is concerned about right now is, in order to support the historic preservation needs of the area, they proposed a very big tower, which you see right here. It doesn't look very big, but in a historic district, it's very, very big, and it actually blocks these historic structures here from the Brooklyn Bridge. And now everybody's throwing up their hands and nobody knows what to do because there's never been a development plan. There's nobody to run the South Street Corporation, so it's sort of going ahead without anybody really deciding anything. So this is sort of the lightning storm that's happening in New York right now. So again, in my view, the real issue here was there was nobody to do any kind of master planning for this area. There was no real understanding of how to put ownership in one set of hands, and really to rely on the private sector and expect them to bear the costs of infrastructure, preserving historic structures, led to all kinds of strange sort of commercial proposals, including a tower in a place where a tower really doesn't belong. Gita asked me just to mention the London Docklands Development Corporation, which many of you know as an entity that got things right. It certainly is something that we've looked at in terms of structuring our own development corporations in New York. Many of you know it existed for 17 years, and it took an awful lot of ramshackle industrial property, post-industrial property in the Docklands, and turned it into some of the most amazingly productive land in London. And this is again showing Canary Wharf. This is what in theory, folks would love to do with their Docklands. This is now moving from commercial to residential. Obviously, part of the Olympics going to London was to reinforce this growth here. But again, I think and you probably know the transit that's been put in there, the Docklands Arc Railway, the Jubilee Line. It's gone from strength to strength. But the lesson that I think we learned in New York and that we've learned from what's happened in London, that the existing port entities have a very hard time sort of transitioning land and thinking about something else. They're busy running a port, and they should be busy running a port. Somebody else needs to be thinking about how to transition old port lands into their new role in modern society. And what we've learned is that if you structure a new entity correctly, a lot of people refer to the institutional framework and the governance. We don't have the governance. But you can make the governance. These were all new ideas, and we created them. We looked at what London did, and we set up development corporations. They haven't been cookie cutter. They've each looked a little different in terms of the makeup and control. But they work because they see their job as effectively a 20-year job, 20, 30-year job. It's not going to happen tomorrow. They're somewhat flexible because plans change along the way, depending on what's fundable. Each of them has balanced this residential, recreational, commercial/industrial uses in a different way. There isn't one formula for that. But all of them have found a way to involve the community in the way that the port agencies that were doing this before were not able to involve the community. And I guess the one thing that I would say, just looking out at the audience here, is that it's really important to remember that any successful development in such a vast area as the port lands here in Mumbai requires some really significant public support in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the planning, in terms of the framework, but it also requires private money, because none of what you saw could really have been developed without support from the private sector as well. And so hopefully more of those private voices will be participating in this discussion as well, because otherwise taking an area as large as the port lands and developing them, it's too much for the public sector to carry along. So hopefully that was helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kate. I think we can take a few questions before we go to the panel discussion. So I can come to you with the mic if you have any questions. You can just raise your hands. No questions? Questions, comments?
There are about 8 connecting bridges and tunnels which connect today Manhattan to the surrounding areas, right? To what extent the traffic gets diverted to these 8 modes of kind of getting to Manhattan. And to what extent it is reduced pressure on Manhattan? Because, Bombay is very similar, and we're talking about a Trans-Harbour link here. And my belief is that the Trans-Harbour link will reduce a lot of pressure on the South Mumbai, and the prices also will kind of come down if the bridge does come up. So the experience of creating this connectivity is what we'd like to know.
Well, can you hear me? Yeah? Can you hear me now? Okay. The only thing I can think about that's akin to that in Manhattan is the George Washington Bridge, which is part of Interstate 95, which allows people to bypass Manhattan Island completely if they're going from New Jersey or from the Atlantic coast up to New England. And so it does keep a certain amount of traffic out of Manhattan, but the problem is it is so heavily used and congested that even though it's tolled, it probably costs $14 to get across it now. If you go at peak hours, you still can't get across it. And it has 2 levels, and it has 6 lanes in each direction on each level. So I think it's true that if you build it, they will come. But in some cases, you do want to make sure that traffic that doesn't need to be in the center of Mumbai or the center of New York doesn't go there. So I think it's a transportation planning question as to what are the origin of the trips, what is the destination, and what's the best way to get people from one place to another. Sometimes it's highway, sometimes it's ferry, sometimes it's train. So I think that's really what everyone needs to look at.
I think like Geeta said, I think the solution does not lie in creating more flyovers and bridges, but to reduce the cost.
I don't know how many of you have been to Istanbul lately, but they've connected under the Bosphorus. They built a rail line now because their bridges were so congested to get from Asia to Europe. And it's fantastic. You just fly under the water from one continent to another. It's really quite impressive.
We need 2 more questions, and then we have to go to the panel discussion. Any more questions? Comments? No more questions? I think I have a question for you.
There's one in the back.
So I'm going to ask you a question, Kate. You mentioned these development corporations that came together to redevelop the Portlands. How are they initiated? Who are the actors that made those multidisciplinary, corporations to come together? How did we create one here? So what's the, process?
Well, obviously it depends on the legal framework, and so I can't speak to the legal framework here. But in the States, when the court was unable to make these plans happen, because it had a plan for each of the areas you saw here, the state and the city were left to come together and figure out what is the right mechanism to be able to have both control over the site, but more importantly, control over the regulatory processes and the financial sort of structure, because that's what was really needed. Same with the London Docklands, because if they had gone through traditional planning processes, none of what you saw in Canary Wharf would have happened. The Docklands Light Rail Line would never have happened. So there's a sense that sometimes you need special consideration and a special framework to do it in. And in the case of New York, the city and the state were happy to put it over there because they were non-elected people. They could do controversial things without being worried about being voted out of office.
I think we have a couple more questions.
Hi. With the vast expertise and knowledge that you have on the subject, and thanks for the great presentation, just wondering if, like the Navy Yard Development Corporation, if Mumbai Port Trust Development Corporation was to be set up, how would you advise on those lines if you were to be advised over the little that you've seen and experienced in the last 2 days? Do you think, because with the Navy Yard you mentioned the return on investment, obviously being a non-profit, it obviously had a long-range view of the ROI. So how would it impact the Port Trust if they were to think along the lines of establishing a non-profit sort of development corporation as an entity?
Right. Well, I guess what I should tell you is, the first thing I just want to make clear is that the port agency in New York did not set up the development corporation. It was not a subsidiary of the Port Authority. It was a completely new legal entity that was set up to make this happen. And so its purpose was to make the transition and the development happen, not to make money, not to do anything else. And in most cases, they've been morphed into other organizations like the Dock Lands Development Corporation in London was disbanded. The reason the money is important is you need money to put in the infrastructure and bring in the private investment. So that is really where those capabilities were focused. So I won't talk about what I think should happen here because I think there's one of the groups that went off an hour ago to figure it out, and it would be interesting to see what they came back with. But there's many people in this room who've been talking about governance and institutional framework, and they've been asking the question, well, how do you actually make it happen? Which I think is the institutional question, because it can't happen with existing actors and business as usual. It will never happen. It won't happen, we're watching these in the next generation if you don't have the right structure to do it. Yeah.
One last question, and then we'll have to do the
in Mumbai, you got around 17 organizations that you create commissions from 17 places. In this case, the Port Authority is the organization you want. But I'm talking about the interfaces with the rest of the city. This particular kind of thing that after seeing what you have said, this will essentially have to be a Narendra Modi project. Only a guy like him who comes and says, I want to do this, only then this thing will go through. Otherwise, I see this thing taking 20 to 30 years happen.
You know,
This will have to go to Narendra Modi, otherwise it will not happen.
I can't comment on particular personalities, but I will say that people in New York really believe that none of this could happen until they set up the first development corporation and started seeing how fast things were moving in a structure that sort of was government, but was also outside of government. Okay? And so when you develop a new creature, people really don't know what to expect, and sometimes that surprise works for you in terms of creating a new place. So that's all I can say.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was very insightful. I think it's probably the key part of the puzzle that we solve is to implement this great idea and visions that we have. I'm now going to request Pranay Vakil, who's the member of the Urban Development Committee, to give Kate a token of appreciation. Thank you so much, Kate, for all your mentorship and advice over the last few months to the Urban Development Committee.